internet has transformed every aspect of life in the 21st century, and that includes crime. So it's probably not surprising to learn that the web has been a bonanza for drug traffickers. Last October, the FBI shut down Silk Road, an online site that was allegedly operating an underground mail-order business for ecstasy, cocaine, and other illegal drugs. Before they were busted, the site's operators were pocketing more than $1 million a month. But no sooner was Silk Road put out of business than others sprang up to meet the demand. Experts tell us that the international online market for drugs is now simply too complex for any individual law enforcement agency or government to keep up with. It's also a world that very few outsiders understand. One of the few journalists who have investigated that world is with us today on Criminal Justice Matters. Mike Power, a British freelancer, was the first to document the online market in mephedrone, a legal substitute for ecstasy that emerged from the underground drug scene in the UK in 2009. He's written a fascinating book, Drugs 2.0, the web revolution that's changing how the world gets high. Mike is in New York this month from England to promote the U.S. version of the book, which will be out later this year. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Your book is Drugs 2.0, but what happened to Drugs 1.0? Is that gone? Is that now history?
No, I think we all wish it was in some ways, but no, I don't think it will ever be history. You know, I think the Drugs 1.0, if we want to define it that way, traditional drugs, traditional, drug distribution systems will always be with us. You know, you're talking about a huge multi-billion-dollar international industry. The Drugs 2.0, my kind of take on the influence of the internet and the web on drug markets. I think the Drugs 2.0 will continue to grow. I think in the last 5 years it's really started to come to prominence with people selling and buying drugs on the internet. And the drugs themselves, Drugs 2.0, I would class as the kind of the novel psychoactive substances. So that's drugs which are legal by 1 or 2 molecules away from the banned drug.
So what's different about these drugs on the internet as opposed to getting them from your corner drug dealer? I mean, well, are they more accessible now to more people, or has it become something that's in the air?
It's a good question. I think they're certainly more accessible. I mean, it's as easy to buy drugs on the internet as it is to buy a record or a book.
Is it really?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the drugs in many cases are completely legal. The drugs can be, slightly tweaked in chemical terms, so there'll be just 1 or 2 molecules slightly different from others. So, I suppose an attractive part of that trade for people is that they can buy these drugs and not face any danger of arrest.
I don't understand that a little bit. I always assumed that when you ban a drug, you're banning a generic kind of drug, or you're banning it generically.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily basing it on its molecular chemistry. But you're saying that we are, that as soon as we decide this is a drug that's going to be banned, the chemists just change the chemistry and then it becomes legal. Is that?
It depends what country you're in. In the US has analog laws which kind of ban kind of categories of drugs and their relatives. The United Kingdom doesn't quite have that, and neither do most European countries, which has been the kind of the locus of my research for this. So yeah, in the US, but still really within the US, you can still get around that by saying that the drug is not for human consumption. So there's loopholes, there are ways around this, and that's what people are, that's what they're kind of exploiting currently.
Is this something we should worry about? I mean, does it make drugs more accessible to everybody, more accessible than they were under Drugs 1.0?
Well, I think that to worry about drugs is it's a false premise, I think that really, we shouldn't be worrying about drugs. We should be worrying about people. We should be worrying about harms.
What do you mean?
Well, I think that as time has kind of developed, as the drug story, as the drug culture has developed, we just have more drugs available. As we ban a drug, another one appears. In the United Kingdom, for example, in the last few years, we have had 243 new compounds appear in just 4 years. Now, the United Nations Single Convention on Psychotropic Drugs bans 234. So we have more legal drugs on sale in the United Kingdom and in the European Union than we have banned under international law. Now, these drugs are new and they're unknown. And, for example, the vast majority of those drugs are actually synthetic cannabinoids, so kind of fake grass that your viewers have probably seen on sale in gas stations and all over the US. And these drugs are far more dangerous, really, than their banned counterparts. And cannabis doesn't kill people, you know. Synthetic
So we would
cannabinoids
ban
have.
the dangerous directions of the dangerous dimensions of these drugs.
I don't think banning anything works, you know. I mean, if we look at heroin, if we look at crystal methamphetamine and cocaine, these drugs are banned, but they're available in every city in the US very easily. People have health problems because of them. Neighborhoods have crime problems because of them. And we have the ultimate, you know, the ultimate stricture, which is to put people in jail, and still people buy it. They make that consumer decision.
Well, let's save a little bit our conversation on drug control and look at a little bit more about what you've uncovered in your investigation about the new drug world. I mean, I take the point that we're never going to get rid of drugs in society. For thousands of years, people have been taking magic pills or ways to enlarge their consciousness. But surely having more around is not necessarily good for us. I mean, we know that alcohol and tobacco are not good for us.
You know, clinicians and doctors have told me that they're finding it more and more difficult to know how to treat people who present with urgent symptoms where they don't know. So just to be clear, I don't think it's a positive thing that there are more drugs that are currently existing. I think it's a consequence of drug laws. The only reason that these new drugs exist, the drugs 2.0 drugs, is because we keep banning new drugs.
You talk a lot in your book about the chemists who uncovered these new molecular formulas and are designing these new drugs. Tell us a little bit about them. Who are these folks and why are they doing it?
Well, for profit in some cases. Who are they, first of all? Who are they? They are a crazy collection of clandestine chemists all over the world. They meet on internet bulletin boards. They discuss various kind of chemical manipulations that you can do to ban drugs, to make them legal. And then they outsource them. They outsource them to Chinese laboratories. The work is mainly done, or nearly always done, overseas. So it's almost like a social network.
For these lone entrepreneurs, I mean, you have a great story about how heroin itself was developed way back in the early 20th century, and then LSD developed as almost a designer drug.
Well, the history of LSD, I mean, the two main designer drugs of the 20th century are LSD and MDMA, ecstasy. Albert Hoffman made LSD. He was actually searching for a way to help women in pregnancy avoid bleeding to death. That was what the drug was. And very often, in the same way as LSD has actually kind of, you know, escaped that original clinical setting and become a drug of choice for people, the same things happened with these new drugs. So with the internet, you have a very easy way for people to share information, academic research papers, you know, psychological studies, things like this. And then people are taking, you know, lone rangers in some cases, or in other cases they're, you know, organized criminals, taking research papers and documents from the internet and having the drugs made in China and then sold all over the world.
In your book, you're careful not to take, as I gather, make a moral judgment on who these people are. But I mean, are they just good guys who are just trying to expand our consciousness, or are they really evildoers? I mean, I have this conspiratorial vision of the government eventually getting a hold of some of these drug formulas out of George Orwell's 1984 and then drugging us all.
Yeah, well, I can see why you'd fear that, but no, I mean, like I said, I think that to see this as in a kind of good guy, bad guy sense, it's really it's flawed. You know, it's money. It's simply money. It's an economic response to an economic situation. While drugs are illegal, they're profitable. You know, while we outsource the sort of the production and distribution of all of these drugs to armed criminal gangs.
And the profits are in bitcoins.
Well, that's another story altogether. The Bitcoin story is amazing. It was like a gift. It was like manna from heaven. The Bitcoin story. My book sort of traces the whole story of internet drugs from the very first deal. Now, the very first piece of e-commerce itself, in fact, was a marijuana deal. The very first thing bought and sold on the internet, the primal act of e-commerce, was a drug deal between students at MIT and Stanford. They bought and sold marijuana across ARPANET. So really, there's nothing.
ARPANET, which was the original
internet.
Defense Department.
The very first thing. This was in a great book by John Markoff called What the Dormouse Saw. And then he lays out the fact that the very first thing bought and sold on the internet was an unspecified quantity of marijuana. So, you know, there's something about the internet, I think, it's like a virtual Bangkok. There's an anonymity there. There's a way for people to express their darker desires. And I think that, buying drugs on the internet, it's a no-brainer, really. And so that's, you don't have to be, captured by the police. You don't have to be shot by a dealer. You don't have to wait on a street corner. We buy everything else online. Why wouldn't we buy our drugs online? So really, the story developed from there back in the 1970s, right through until almost a week before I actually filed the book to my publisher, with the emergence of the Silk Road, which was the online dark web, anonymous web drug market where you could buy any drug you wanted. You could buy absolutely any drug in almost any quantity.
But when there's huge money involved, that's when criminals start getting involved. And then we're back to square one, aren't we?
Absolutely. And, I think that's the riddle that anyone working in drug policy has to unravel. How do you make it so? How do you make policy that actually takes the finance, that takes the money out of this game? And you say the bitcoins. I mean, that's an attempt to wrestle away the control of the currency markets from the government. Whether or not it will be successful remains to be seen. They seem to get hacked every other week. Every Bitcoin exchange there's ever been ends up either hacked or shut down by the government in some way. So really, the whole internet drug story, I think, will keep developing, and it won't override the drugs 1.0, but drugs 2.0. I think it's here to stay one way or another.
Mike, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Silk Road was selling cocaine on the web at around $99 a gram. That's about $2,800 an ounce, more than twice the cost of an ounce of gold for a product that costs a few $100s to make. Some say our war on drugs is to blame for the distorted values. Anti-narcotics laws, they say, drive the business underground and have helped to spawn murderous cartels. That's not necessarily an argument for legalizing cocaine, but as the lawmakers try to outpace the chemists who are creating new designer drugs every month to avoid prosecution, aren't they just making things worse? To help us sort through the limits of drug control in the age of the internet, we're joined by Stephanie Jones of the Drug Policy Alliance, one of the leading groups campaigning for drug law reform. Stephanie, welcome to Criminal Justice Matters.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Stephanie, Mike and I were just talking about how difficult it is to control drug use, especially when anybody or his brother can develop a new dimension of a different drug and change something that was illegal before into something that's legal. Do we really want to keep going and trying to control these things, or is there another paradigm that we can use?
Well, I think that's the question at hand. I mean, we have totally changed the context of drug use with all these drugs, the drug 2.0, as Mike was talking about. And so far, the U.S. has really followed the same old policy that they've always done with trying to prohibit them. And even though the context of use, like the use levels here in the U.S. are not as high as they are in other countries, we're only seeing it expand. And so we really do have to think about a new way to handle this, because the idea of prohibiting and each chemical getting changed is just not very effective. So there's actually been a new model that's tried in New Zealand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, just a second, but I mean, you can't, in a sense, blame the government for trying to control something that is or can be harmful. I mean, this is the paradigm we've been operating on for 70 years. Drugs are bad, or certain types of drugs are bad, with alcohol, cigarettes. So it's not necessarily banning them, it's controlling them, or controlling their use, restricting them to adults, not minors. I mean, those approaches are not totally wrong, are they?
No, and I think you can totally understand the reaction. Like with all these new chemicals on the market, we hear a lot of stories about people having really bad experiences with them. And so I think the impulse to try and control it is absolutely natural. I think that what's been tried, which is essentially what, the banning and prohibiting, hasn't been as effective as we would like, because those chemicals are still out there. They're still on the market, and they're still dangerous.
So why has New Zealand suddenly come into the picture?
New Zealand is an interesting case because, as one of the people who works down there told me, they make their drugs down there because it's
They make their drugs.
It's outside of most of the shipping routes for the drugs 1.0 that Mike mentioned. So a lot of these new chemicals are being produced by business people down there, and so they had a lot broader use and a lot of wider range of use of these chemicals. And so they decided, first they tried the same things that other countries were trying to prohibit them, and the producers would just change a chemical. And so it was the same thing that other countries were already experiencing. And so at a certain point, the legislators got together and they decided we have to try something radically different. Like if we really want to, put the emphasis on people's health and safety first, we're going to ask these producers to step forward into the light and prove that the substances that they're making can pass these health and safety tests.
And how do they do that? Who sets those tests?
Well, they've actually, so what's incredible about this new law that they passed is that it passed almost unanimously. So like in all the different political parties, they came together and they agreed that this is the way forward. It created a new regulatory system within the government, and they're in the process right now to set up like a board that will establish these tests for producers.
And this applies to all drugs, whether we're talking about cocaine, or are we talking about designer drugs, or heroin, marijuana?
Just the ones that are outside of the UN convention, so all of the new sort of legal highs.
So this, in a way, gets to your point about this is really a business, particularly as it reaches the internet. So is regulating the use of the drugs one answer, or should we really go after the internet itself and say this is perhaps we have to police the internet a little bit better, or the web a little bit better?
I think that it's impossible to police the web. It's like trying to police the bottom of the ocean. It's a vast, lawless place. I think what we need to do is to look at the harms that these drugs produce, because they do, some of them cause harm. There's no doubt about that. They're not something that you would encourage anyone you knew to take. But instead, to say let's get the least harmful of them, and let's perhaps in some way legitimize their use, or at least use the law to make sure that people are facing less harm, rather than just banning a drug and then another drug takes its place, which is even more unknown, which has been the market response over the last 5 years.
It's funny, just when you thought drug policy was settled, when now that Washington and Colorado are legalizing, in effect, marijuana, and people are saying, wow, this is now, we've really come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years, and now you guys are saying that, no, we haven't actually, because marijuana is kind of your grandfather's, your father's drug, and we shouldn't be thinking about that. What kids are really onto in the web is something totally new.
Well, I think that in New Zealand, the use of these drugs was so high because, as one of our mutual contacts has told me, the cocaine boat doesn't stop in New Zealand. It's completely out the way. So people made their own drugs there. They made amphetamines and methamphetamines, and also there's quite a strict legislative environment in New Zealand around marijuana. So people are looking for synthetic alternatives, and they're looking for legal alternatives.
You mean it's not legal in New Zealand to smoke marijuana, or they have not, or grow marijuana?
It's quite punitively policed. So
interesting.
Yeah. So this is the thing, that these legal drugs are always a response to extreme legal environments. For example, in Scandinavia, in Sweden, where there's a great deal of use of these drugs. It's always in the places where you go to jail for longest that people are trying to take these legal drugs. In British prisons, the use of legal synthetic marijuana is on the increase because people can smoke it in jail, have it smuggled in, and then it won't show up on a drug test. Same in the US. The college kids who want to get an education or they want to travel, it's safer for them to take a toxic, unknown chemical rather than smoking marijuana.
Which they access on the internet.
Which they buy on the internet.
But it has to be shipped somehow. It has to be shipped through the U.S. mails.
Yes.
And there's something is illegal about that, right? You can stop it if you it's smuggling, basically. Well, you intercept a package and you can arrest the people who sent it.
Not necessarily, because the chemicals contained are not written into any law. The chemicals that these drugs contain, it's quite a clever riddle. None of these drugs are, or the majority of these synthetic cannabinoids are not illegal. And as soon as they are illegal, well, you can just make a new one.
But talk about a little bit. There's one, for instance, there's a spice, which is one example of a synthetic cannabinoid, which has been particularly harmful.
Spice was a really interesting drug. It came out in the United Kingdom in about 2007, and at that point, spice was, nobody knew what was in it. And what happened in the United Kingdom, the Vietnamese gangs that actually grow the majority of the marijuana in London had started spraying the crop with glass beads to make the marijuana look more potent, like it was crystallized and frosty. So this increased the weight by up to 20%. So it was a no-brainer. You could make an extra £200-300 for a kilo on each one. People started to realize that this was a really terrible smoke, and it started to harm people, hurt the lungs, and the market responded with a synthetic cannabinoid. This was just imported from China, sprayed onto damiana, various other herbs, and sold as spice. Nobody knew what it was until a university team in Germany discovered it. And it turned out to actually be a chemical that had been invented by Professor Emeritus at Clemson University, a guy called John William Huffman. That was why the drug's initials were JWH018. A lot of these drugs have names like postcodes or like zip codes. Right. So JWH018 was being smoked all across the world at this point, round about the time in 2007, that marijuana supplies were low in Britain, or rather contaminated. And this drug was originally invented as a synthetic cannabinoid agonist for the human endogenous cannabinoid system in order to research non-steroidal anti-inflammatories.
But it's dangerous.
Well,
dangerous
substance. Dangerous is a relative term. It's an unknown substance. It's a new substance. It's a synthetic substance. So there was no knowledge about it. Nobody knew anything about it. Very potent as well, active at 1 milligram.
Okay, so Stephanie, back to you again. So in the U.S., in terms of U.S. policy anyway, the movement to legalize marijuana, we now have two main experiments going on in Washington and Colorado. Is that a good thing? Is that opening up the possibilities for smarter drug control policy in the U.S.?
Well, I think actually what the synthetic drug conversation does is helps people think about, more palatable alternatives. Like we can try and answer this question about what to do with all of these chemicals, some of which may have very, serious harms to people, or we can just take a look at what people actually want in the first place. Because a lot of the synthetic chemicals are meant to mimic the effects of the drugs 1.0, the classics. So you have the synthetic cannabinoids, you have a class of drugs called cathinones that are meant to sort of mimic MDMA and methamphetamine sort of things. And, so it's and we actually, even though research is blocked, we know more about those classic drugs.
Would legalizing marijuana reduce the market for these synthetic drugs?
I think that's a strong argument, yeah. I think it would, especially, and again, in the New Zealand context, synthetic cannabinoids became popular because there was such harsh punishment for marijuana in that country.
Mm-hmm. But in other words, otherwise, people are going to be accessing these drugs one way or the other on the internet, certainly. And that's an issue that
they're probably not going away. That's definitely the truth.
It's a lot to ponder there.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to both of you.
Yes, thank you.
Whatever you think about legalized drugs, Mike Power's disclosures about drugs and the internet don't just represent a challenge to law enforcement. When the local drug dealer can be replaced by an anonymous website thousands of miles away, it's not your grandfather's drug scene anymore. We're already a society that's addicted to drugs, both legal and illegal, and we also value getting anything we want from the privacy of our homes with a simple click. If you put both together, it's clear that we're heading into uncharted territory. That should worry any educator or parent. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next month.